you agree with that? And also, is it just the Tigray region that we should be focusing on, or the whole of Ethiopia that you're concerned about?
It's a good question. I think we are concerned about the whole of Ethiopia. Tigray is definitely the most complex and the most difficult to address at the moment, and I agree with everything that Eddie has said. But we are seeing crisis unfold in other parts of the country, like in Metakel and Benishangul Gumuz, and we see a drought has increased the number of people that are needing assistance in Somali region. And as we go up towards the elections, we can expect there to be more conflict and displacement. And we really need to be ready for that. And it's difficult to be juggling so many different crises in the country, both from the point of view of the authorities in the country, but also for our supporting donors outside the country, because it's hard to focus really and prioritize when the demands are so big. There will be a humanitarian response plan issued. It's currently under review at the highest level of government. And so that will give people an idea of the scope of the crisis this year. But we would say at the moment that in complexity terms and in risk terms, human risk terms, Tigray is the worst.
Thank you. Can I bring in Pauline Latham?
Yes, thanks very much. There's obviously a number of key agencies working there, the relief agencies in response to this crisis. Is it a well-coordinated response? And is the money that people like the British government are giving, is it getting into Tigray as well as going elsewhere? But I don't know if Paul wants to start and if Eddie follows up.
Yes, I think that there are a lot of agencies on the ground now. The humanitarian NGOs were there right throughout the crisis. Not many of them actually left. So there were about 500 staff who were there right throughout the crisis. And then there's been a big injection of additional staff, both from the UN and the NGO community in since. So there are a lot of people on the ground at this point. I would say we still got some way to go in terms of the coordination. While there have been structures set up, the great problems are the communications. The limit. We're basically limited to VSATs, and a few selected ADSL and fiber lines have been reconnected. And this makes coordination extremely difficult, especially in a COVID environment where face-to-face meetings have to be limited to the number of people and spacing, etc. So I think it is quite difficult to coordinate under these community restrictions. I wouldn't worry about the money not being used correctly in Tigray. There's huge demands for it. And while we are facing some difficulties in some sectors in terms of coordination, I don't think that should be an impediment to addressing these huge needs in that region.
Sorry, Eddie.
Sure. So there are 56 international humanitarian organizations operating in Ethiopia as part of a Hingo Forum network. We invested over $680 million last year, directly impacting 28 million people. Prior to the conflict in November in Tigray, there were 17 operational international NGOs, primarily focused on development. There are now 24, with 9 more coming in as space has opened up. We've already been able to reach over 1.2 million people with food, predominantly through the NGO pipeline, and well over 1 million other beneficiaries have benefited from health, water, shelter, non-food items, multipurpose cash, protection, and nutrition services. So the need is still far greater than the current response, but we're scaling up as fast as we can, and I would say we're doing so in a very efficient manner. We can't know everything, we can't be everywhere, but we're doing what we can where we can.
And we've seen some hideous news items in the evenings where people have been murdered and in shallow graves and lots of burnt out vehicles with guns on and things. Is that just in a small area or is that a huge area? I don't know who wants to. Paul, do you want to cover that?
I have a stab at it. Yes, I would say the evidence at the moment, Pauline, is very anecdotal, and that there are definitely a lot of incidents that have been reported. We don't really have a full picture of what it is like everywhere in the region. We are getting more humanitarian access in Tigray. We basically got the permission from the government to go anywhere, and internationals can go anywhere. But there are lots of security issues still that are being faced. There's a lot of fighting that's on, so that is limiting the effective access. Even if the government has given permission for international agencies to move, we obviously have to be careful where we go, given the insecurity in the region. So there has been a declaration by the Office of the Prime Minister that independent evaluations, investigations will be allowed. But when they say that, these, I believe, are ones by the Ethiopian Human Rights Agency. So to some extent, they may not be seen as independent, but they have offered that UN agencies would be able to join these investigations. They haven't happened yet, but they haven't indicated a willingness for the UN agencies to join those ones by the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission.
Thank you. Did you want to add anything, Eddie?
Yes, please. I would say, yes, throughout Tigray region, west, north, east, south, there has been widespread violence and conflict, and civilians are suffering every day. And that hasn't stopped. It's very fluid, it's very unpredictable, but every day I'm dealing with security incidents on a regular basis. We had 82 staff in Tigray before the conflict and during the conflict, and we've scaled up significantly since. We're in the process of hiring a couple hundred more staff. Before the conflict last year, our total spend in Tigray was about 3.9 million. This year we expect it to be well over 25 million, just to give you an idea of the scope of expansion. Basically a 5 or 6-fold increase in terms of humanitarian expenditures. And it takes a lot of communication, coordination, and courage, I would say, because you don't always know what you're going to find when you get there, but we've been pushing the envelope, and thank God our staff are all accounted for. I know in the refugee camps where other NGOs work, there was a lot of things that happened, particularly at the beginning, including NGO staff perishing. So I don't want to downplay the ongoing insecurity and humanitarian crisis that is still ongoing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I bring in Brendan Clark-Smith?
Sorry, just unmuting myself. Thank you for that, Chair. Good afternoon, everybody. Eddie, if I can just ask you, how easy is it to get personnel, equipment and supplies to where they're needed? And what would you say the main logistical challenges with that are?
Yeah, I think Paul can answer the logistical piece insofar as WFP and the UN logistics cluster is very active, and he's got broad scope. As far as World Vision is concerned, we have 7 bases across Tigray, everywhere except Western Tigray, and we've opened new offices since then in Adigrat and Axum, and so you can move around, you can do some things. For example, we've done $450,000 in distribution of multi-purpose cash. So that's easy. It's not low risk, but at least it's not a 30-ton truck going down a road. And so we've done what we can where we can. I would say in general, the humanitarian community has been focused on urban areas because those are more accessible than rural areas. In the case of World Vision, we have staff in rural areas that they've been there the whole time. And we have a huge network of volunteers who follow up on our sponsored children in the communities that we've been serving for over 40 years. So I think that has enabled us to do a bit more in rural areas than other agencies. But that said, there's still a lot of places that need to be reached and a lot of work that needs to be done.
Okay, and just on that, what do you think needs to happen to enable that? And especially you said about the rural areas. What more can be done to tackle that, do you think?
Yeah, more done. I mean,
in terms of access to the humanitarian stuff.
Right. So in the case of World Vision, we've been using primarily private funds, front loading to do what we can. So I think more public funding needs to come in, and that will enable us to do more. As Paul alluded to, there's freedom of movement in principle. The only constraint is security, and security is very dynamic. And most of us have worked in war zones over many years. There's ways and means with civ-mil coordination, with communication, to try to be able to see, okay, where can we go, when, etc. As far as I'm concerned, as humanitarian community, as the United Nations, we're doing everything we can to get everywhere we can, but maybe Paul can pick it up on that specific logistics question. There are some practicalities. I would say Djibouti port is no picnic, but I don't know if there's any sort of quick solutions to open up in terms of moving the logistical pipeline speeding up. Over.
Okay, thank you, Paul.
Yes, thanks. So the situation in November and December was really terrible. It wasn't until about the middle of December that ICRC and then WFP was able to deliver anything from the outside of Tigray. And there was no movement from the stocks that were already in Mekelle because there was no fuel and there was just no way to move things from Mekelle to the other areas. But it has picked up. So we've been able, for example, to be able to deliver about 20,000 tons of food for the government that they needed some help on procurement and transport, and WFP was able to deliver that into Mekelle in January and February, and that was for the government's own relief program. And we have also been able to, through the logistics cluster, deliver non-food items into Tigray reasonably easily since about, I would say, since the middle of January. So things have definitely improved, but we're currently in a situation where there has been a lot of movement into the main urban areas, and we haven't tested fully some of the more remote areas and areas that are occupied by foreign forces. Now we are told that the government, transitional government in Mekelle, the regional government, is fine with agencies going into the Eritrean-controlled areas and delivering assistance. We haven't really tested that to see how easy it is to distribute once you get there. The logistics cluster has been delivering through checkpoints that have foreign troops manning them, and manning them too much hassle. They have been across, but actually delivering and distributing assistance, I don't think that's really been tested well enough to be confident about it. But we've really got to try. I think the next few weeks is going to be a situation where we're really probing to, as Eddie puts it, push the envelope. That we're not going to be able to find out until we try. We would like as much security as we can guarantee our staff and partners. We're not allowed to have armored vehicles here, unlike some countries. And of course, we've got a problem with the radio and radios we may be able to get, but most agencies rely on satellite telephones, and we're terribly short of those, and especially on the side of the NGOs. So that's something we really want to push hard. We have been pushing with the government at the highest possible level, and we've had some success in increasing the telecommunications, but unfortunately the sat phones is still something that's stuck. And I would say that is absolutely essential if we're going to be able to have access with safety.
Thank you very much for that.
Yep. Being a little bit humble, the head of WFP, David Beasley, came recently, and I think that was a real watershed. I think that high-level diplomacy has really borne fruit in terms of within a week of that visit, some of these things opened up in terms of logistics, in terms of bureaucratic impediments, and in terms of on this communications issue. A few NGOs now have internet in McPhail. I learned that this morning, so that's good and that's progress. But yeah, as Paul said, there's still corners of Tigray, and I would say particularly in the west, that we're not sure how bad it is. We know a lot of people have fled from there. When I was in McPhail in January and February, most of the people had come from the far west, and some of the people from the far west up in Humera tried to come back and were pushed back again. So there's been multiple displacements, and I would say the situation in the west is the most unknown and perhaps the most severe at this point. Over.
Thank you, Eddie. So on that point particularly, then, would you say there's an issue with having the necessary data to be able to establish the level of need in particular regions?
Well, I'm a little hesitant. A lot of people are pushing data. We know it's very bad. We know 4.5 million people, over 80% of the population, are in dire need. Even before the conflict, there was a high need for humanitarian assistance. So, and it's a fluid situation too. So I know some donors are asking for data. We have a lot of information. We know needs. We have staff on the ground. We've been there ourselves. So it's an imperfect situation. I think the general approach, and Paul, you can come in here as well, like particularly with food on the first round, general broad distributions under the assumption that an overwhelming majority of the people, particularly if they're displaced, need food, and then we can more tightly target in subsequent months. But I wouldn't want humanitarian assistance to be delayed by more assessments or more data, because frankly, it's a humanitarian emergency, and we need to do what we can, and not use lack of information as a reason not to.
Great, thank you, Eddie. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Can I bring in Chris Law, please? Oh, sorry, I do apologise. Can I bring in Virendra Sharma? Thank you, Virendra.
Thank you very much. I thought I have disappeared from the planet. Eddie, what are the key challenges that you face in your day-to-day work?
Wow, sounds like a job interview question. As I said, security, every day there's security incidents. I would say logistics and communication, because for a long time, the whole region was cut off from communication. And just the nuts and bolts. I mean, this is a huge, complex organization. We have over 1,500 staff spread across the country. So banking, which has been a big problem, it's gotten slightly better, but that has been a big constraint to be able to transfer money, to pay staff, to buy things that can be of use and service to the people we're serving. So it's these practical day-to-day things that Tigre, it's been a real challenge. Over.
Paul?
Yes, everything that he has just said, plus the fact that so many of the line ministries in Tigray have become basically dysfunctional. We hear about 70% of the health centers, for example, in Tigray are no longer working, and these basic structures used to give us ways to reach the vulnerable people, and now they just don't exist. Staff from the government, if they're still in their position, they haven't been paid for months. Once you get out of the main towns, the banks are not working, and the lack of that basic infrastructure that normally we've relied on is a huge problem to implementing a response. So really having to do things in a very different way. It's certainly not business as usual anymore. And I would say that especially the NGOs have been very good at innovating ways of reaching the people that are in need. Their sort of grassroots representation, that deep field presence, has been a real benefit in order to mount a response. And as Eddie was saying earlier, typically the NGOs that were in Tigray have had more of a development focus than an emergency focus. Having said that, I think most of those also had emergency experience that they could draw on. So they already had a footprint. and they were able to expand and scale up their operations towards the scale that is really needed. But I would also add one more thing. The funding has not really been that great, considering the needs that are on the ground. And we do know that many donor countries that we've relied on in the past, they're having a very difficult time in terms of their own economies. So the timing in terms of the response for Tigray is rather difficult. We do know that a lot of governments don't have the same sorts of funding levels for overseas assistance as they used to have. But that is causing us, I think it's all a problem. WFP fortunately has the facility to borrow from its internal resources. So we've been able to borrow about $30 million against the likelihood of high probability forecast from donors. And that's allowing us to move quickly. But if we didn't have that facility, we wouldn't have been able to buy and transport a thing so far. We really depended on that sort of advanced financing facility in order to respond as we're doing now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, you said one of the resources are the funding, which you're looking at by borrowing and other side. Is there any other resource you need to overcome those crises or challenges?
Yes, I would say that the resources that the agencies have in country and what they can draw on from their other parts of the world, because that's what inevitably happens in these situations. We draw staffing from other sides in the world. I think they're rather adequate. The telecommunications is still a problem for us. That really is affecting the ability to coordinate, the safety of our staff. But I think funding would make a huge difference in terms of being able to respond quickly to this crisis. Thank you.
I will ask Eddie to say that to what extent does COVID-19 and its secondary impacts affect your operations? Take whoever first.
So we've had over 100 staff get infected since the beginning of the crisis. We had a peak July, August, and I'd say over the last month, some more staff have. Most have been asymptomatic, but it does obviously force us to work from home and not be as mobile as usual. Under normal circumstances, I'm in the field 2 or 3 times a month for upwards of 2 to 4 days, whereas with COVID that's limited. So footprint, it affects, and obviously a staff capacity insofar as it affects our staff as well. I mean, honestly, it's like the 10 plagues of Egypt, and COVID is now probably 8th or 9th on the list. We had desert locusts, now we have conflict, we have hunger. And so in relative terms, COVID has gone down the list, but it's still in the background and potentially rearing its ugly head. It certainly had massive economic impact. And I think, again, it's like the perfect storm of everything that could have gone wrong has. Maybe just to add to Paul's previous answer, just to give an idea as sort of scale and scope, in previous years, the average ask in terms of humanitarian has been about $1 billion. It's probably going to be closer to $2 billion. So the needs have doubled, but the available resources have shrunk, both from the donor side as well as, I would say, to a certain extent from the government side, because they're dealing with COVID, they're dealing with desert locusts, and now they're dealing with conflict. So I can't overemphasize how bad it is. Paul has been in this neighborhood for decades, and we were actually having a conversation earlier this morning, and it's in relative terms, it's historic how bad it is and how big the needs are and what an existential crisis we face.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oh, sorry, Brenda, please carry on.
No, I said thank you.
Thank you. In that case, it is my pleasure to introduce and bring in Chris Law.
Thank you, Chair. the numbers I've been looking at, 1.4 million people displaced from violence, set to increase by another 500,000 in this last year. Can I ask what the current humanitarian crisis is, Paul, for internally displaced persons?
Yes, it's one that has been boiling for a while. That since probably 2017, it really has become a huge issue in Ethiopia. It's extremely political as well. So we have faced times where there were maybe up to I think 3 or even 4 million people displaced. And I think it was the fastest rate of displacement anywhere in the world in 2018. While that has calmed down to some extent in other parts of the country, in Tigray it has become really huge. We don't really have a full idea of the total populations, but we're probably looking at something like 500,000, and maybe that's a conservative estimate. So this makes it extremely difficult to respond to the needs of those people, because they really come with nothing. So it really needs a comprehensive response, which was quite difficult to mount in the context of Tigray at the moment. But it's a crisis that there are the agencies that have experience in IDP responses in Ethiopia already. They are here. The government also takes on responsibility for the IDPs, particularly, for example, at the moment around Shire, between the JOP partners and the government. There is food going in there, but we need a very comprehensive response if we're going to reduce the loss of life of people who have travelled with nothing but the shirts off their backs.
Just to add, there's on average about 1,500 internally displaced people reportedly arriving in Shire town every day in recent days, including hundreds of unaccompanied minors. So according to the Labor of Social Affairs, BOLSA, in Tigray, the estimate is over 900,000 internally displaced people. So that is a huge percentage of the overall population. And it comes on the heels of other mass displacements and ongoing displacements. McPhail was mentioned earlier in Benishangul Gumez. There's been a lot of displacement in Oromia and in the southern region over the last 2 or 3 years. So the IDP crisis is ongoing and in many ways worsening.
And with this situation worsening, what is the pressure like for the camps where they're going to, and also the host communities?
Yes, I think at the moment a lot of people, there's been a lot of the communities have been absorbing and assisting to a greater degree. As far as I know, Eddie, there are not too many sort of large IDP camps of the like that we saw in Somali region, for example, that are actually still there after 3 or 4 years. But I think that the community's capacity to be able to help their relatives and neighbours will be stretched to the point that it will break. That those people don't have much capacity to assist. So I think that we probably can avoid camps if we are able to provide enough services to the IDPs and their hosts in all areas. I think we definitely like to avoid that we set up these camps like we have in Somali region with Koloji, 70,000 people. It's a city, and but it doesn't have the resources and facilities of a city. So I think this, and also if we're able to get enough food and other assistance in, it might stop people from crowding into the urban centres. So there really is a pressure for us to get assistance out into the rural areas so people can stay on their farms. If we are able to do it quickly enough, some people at least would be able to stay on their farms, plant their crops, and even harvest something at the end of this year. Otherwise, we'll just have this cycle of displaced people who will get into a camp and then after years and years still be there. It's really important that we intervene now.
And is that crisis spilling over into
misnomer insofar as most of the IDPs are living in schools, open spaces, and as Paul said, with host communities. So, for example, I visited multiple schools. World Vision had built many schools over the years in Tigray, and there's no school system at all. The schools are being used either for garrison for troops or as camps for IDPs. So again, education is not even being talked about because most kids haven't been in school since before the COVID crisis. But that's another cost of the conflict. Over.
And can I just ask what tensions it's causing in terms of neighbouring countries and their refugee camps?
I'll have a go at that one, Eddie.
Yes.
So we've got about 60,000 people left Tigray to go into Sudan, the Republic of. So that I would say they've been welcomed, and I think they've been pretty well looked after. In fact, the preparation for, or rather the response for the refugees that crossed into Sudan, I would say was pretty well organized, and yeah, certainly from what we could see from here, the conditions were pretty good over there. Of course, the Eritrean refugee dynamic is much more difficult, and we still don't really know what's happened to the refugees from Hitsas and Shimelba camps, which were basically destroyed. We know that many of those people have either crowded into Shire town or being relocated to the sort of southern camps of Adi Harush and Moyani in the southern part of that zone. But we don't really have the numbers to be sure of where those people ended up. We think there are about 35,000 people now in Moyani and Adi Harush. There used to be 25,000, so 10,000 appear to have ended up there. And we don't know to what extent people have either gone to other parts of Ethiopia. We do know that some of them have ended up in the Hora region, and some of them may have ended up back in Eritrea. There are a lot of, I think, unanswered questions about the whereabouts of the refugees from those two camps.
Thank you.
Paul, could I just ask you a little more on that? So that sounds a very concerning situation, that you don't know where these people are, if indeed what situation they're in. Is that just because of lack of access to the region to be able to get that information, or do you feel that information is being withheld in some way?
I think it's really lack of access. That area was very, very badly hit, and I think some NGOs have had some access to Shimelba and Hitsas camps, but I think it's only been in the last week that UN staff were able to get there. And I assume that UNHCR has just recently got some reports about that. There were some refugees who actually just stayed there. There were, I believe, 6,000 people from the Kunama ethnic group who just said they're not going to move. They're just going to stay where they are in Shimelba, and they'll manage somehow, but they didn't want to be relocated to the other two camps. So that's another piece of the arithmetic, but there's still some huge gaps there that that are unexplained. I think, as you know, if the facilities in the two southern camps are upgraded, or another camp is established where the conditions are good, it might be that some of the scattered refugees around Shire area may volunteer to be relocated to those camps, but we're not certain about that yet.
Thank you very much. Can I bring Brenda Sharma back in, please?
Thank you, Chair. Adi, how is the crisis affecting the delivery of essential services such as education, health, and vaccination programs?
As I said, education, to my knowledge, Nothing's happening formally. World Vision had reading camps before that operated even when schools were closed, using volunteers, parents, etc. But to my knowledge, there's no formal education happening. Immunization, I don't know. World Vision, I know about 80% of health posts and hospitals, which before the crisis, it had some of the best health systems and health staff in the country. So it's gone from a very high level to a very low level in a very short time. So I think my big fear now is disease outbreak, frankly, particularly with rain coming, etc. Access to water is going to become a huge, huge crisis. World Vision's been doing water trucking, which is not ideal. It's expensive and it's not a permanent solution, but at least it saves lives. So yeah, those are very big issues, and the focus now seems to be on food and security, but there's a lot of other huge needs as well.
Paul, you want to add anything?
Yes. The health system, really, the fact that has collapsed in a time when we got COVID surging in Ethiopia. You're probably aware that the flights from Ethiopia to London were cut today because of variants, and we noticed a huge increase in cases of basically our own staff, because this is the only way we can monitor. There's so little testing done in the country now. As Eddie said, it's such a low priority, COVID, for the general population. In fact, the head of the WHO said the first casualty of the conflict in Tigray was COVID-19 risk reduction measures, because they've largely been abandoned. I mean, we still try as responsible humanitarian agencies. We try to insist on the social spacing, physical distancing, I should say. We try to make sure that there's PPE worn, but apart from in those situations, you won't see the general public adhering to these measures much anymore. So the COVID crisis is one of many, but I think that the collapse of the health system in Tigray is going to cost a lot of lives.
Thank you. Can I bring Pauline back, please?
Yes, thank you. This is particularly to Eddie. Do you have any concerns about the impact of the crisis on women and girls, and how can we best protect them?
Yeah. As a father of two daughters and having taken my daughters to different parts of this country, that's a emotional question for me. I've talked to children in Tigray, some of whom we've sponsored over the years. I don't know where they are. I'm deeply disturbed, and it's you just hear the most horrible reports. I was in Sierra Leone during the war and Angola after the war, so I'm not new to this kind of context, but it never ceases to break your heart, and I'm deeply disturbed. Quick answer to your question: presence. In other words, the more staff we get on the front lines and in these rural areas, I think the more protection it provides, and so that's huge. And also, there's a huge need for counseling. Our staff have had psychosocial counseling. They were traumatized. Everybody there is traumatized. So many of the people I talked to, they insisted that, yes, I'm hungry, yes, I'm thirsty, but I'm also angry. I'm also, I want you to tell my story, because horrible things happen to my children, horrible things happen to my wife, and we need our dignity, we need our humanity.
Yeah, thank you. Is there any specific support for women and girls in Tigray? And do your team hear anything about trafficking and sexual violence and gender-based violence specifically in that area?
I don't know about trafficking, but definitely gender-based violence, rape as a weapon of war. We do dignity kits. We have child-friendly spaces. But again, it's primarily in urban areas where the lucky have managed to escape. So a lot of concern for areas where where there isn't that access. Over.
Thank you, Paul. Did you have anything to add on that side of things?
Yes, I think that it's sadly a huge cost of the unleashing a lot of different troops throughout the region, and unfortunately the lines of command and control may not be strong enough to keep the. But I think there are ongoing fears because of the lack of law and order. That the police forces largely collapsed. They're trying to re-establish that, but there's a certain impunity to all forms of crime at the moment in much of Tigray. They really and McPhail used to be one of the most orderly towns. You could wander around even at night without problems, and you were just not harassed. Whereas now there are security incidents all of the time. We just get them reported by our staff. But of course we can imagine just how bad that is for people who are much more vulnerable than our staff.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you very much. We've just been joined by the Minister. Perfect timing for the last question, which is by Chris Law.
Thank you, Chair, and I hope the Minister can listen to this question. Paul, I suppose you've heard a lot about the SCDO's changes and its current strategy and its future strategy. If there was one change you could ask the Minister and the SCDO to do, what would it be?
Oh gosh. You caught me off guard there, Chris. We have been a beneficiary of DFID and FCDO for the last decade. DFID contributed over $400 million to WFP Ethiopia, and in fact, even last year, the funding increased actually slightly from what it was in the previous year. We would urge that funding be provided to curtail this humanitarian catastrophe that is unfolding in Tigray, and that an eye be kept on Ethiopia as a whole, given the huge humanitarian needs here. That may not be as specific ask as you like, but I think that if I'm talking to a donor at the moment, funding really is a serious issue for us, and we do expect fair burden sharing among the donors, but we can testify to a very serious situation that has unfolded in Tigray. Thank you.
Thank you.
You want me to answer that as well? I would say pick one thing, and my advice would be women and children. To me, that transcends the politics, that transcends the complexity, and it's very compelling and urgent in terms of whether it's funding it or whether it's advocating around those issues. I think that can have an impact. And I think in some of the personal diplomacy that I alluded to earlier, that has had an impact at the highest levels here. So that would be a huge step forward and a huge point of emphasis that I think can have an immediate impact.
Thank you.
Paul, Eddie, thank you so much for this session. And also, if you could relay our absolute thanks and gratitude to your team on the ground for the work they're doing. It must be just unimaginably challenging out there, and we're just so grateful that you keep on going with it. So thank you very, very much. I'd now like to turn to our second panel, which is led by the Minister for Africa, Minister James Duddridge. Thank you so much for joining us. I wonder if you could start by introducing your team. We've just heard, and I quote back Eddie Brown from World Vision, "I cannot overstate how dire the situation is. We've been hearing the grim reality of it. I know that you're abreast of it, Minister, so it's really good to hear your sort of thinking about how we try and stabilise this region. I know that you have a statement that you'd like to make at the beginning, so if I can hand over to you for the statement and to introduce your team, please. Oh, and microphone.
Thank you, Chair. Sadly, Ed's right. It is a grim situation. So if you were looking for reassurance in HNG, you're looking in the wrong place. I will introduce my team, but right at the outset, can I say Ethiopia matters massively to me and to Her Majesty's government. It is the largest bilateral programme in the world that we have for UK aid. And in the last financial year, we spent just shy of £300 million on UK aid. I don't profess to be an expert, but as you say, I've brought along with me. But I did actually visit Ethiopia for the first time in 2006 when I was a member of the International Development Committee with the committee, so knew it a little from them. And I've visited 4 times since, most recently last July when I was hosted by Dr. Alastair McPhail, our ambassador who joins us here today. At the time, he explained to me that the country was complex and the neighbourhood was complex, and that was before the current crisis which we're examining now in Tigray. It is grim. The conflict is having a profound and devastating impact on the region and on civilians specifically. Over 4.5 million people are in need of life-saving aid, and the UN assesses the humanitarian response to be deeply inadequate, and huge numbers remain beyond reach of the aid agencies, and we can go into the whys and wherefores of that. Recently, officials from our embassy based in Addis have travelled to Tigray on the 4th and 5th of March. That included our political lead, Sam Sherman, Dr. Rogg, our development director, who's also with me today to give evidence, and Dan Cliff, who is our humanitarian expert. To be frank, listening to the stories that they came back with was harrowing second, third hand, let alone what it must be like in reality. And they very much witnessed the complexities of a very difficult operational environment, but also very clear civilian suffering. There were a huge, harrowing number of accounts of abuses and areas where progress is being hamstrung by government obfuscation, and there is an inability to keep up with the needs of the area. The conflict has caused collapse in all essential services, health, water, sanitation, basic life-saving maternal health care, vaccinations. You know, the core of development work is not deliverable. Furthermore, there have been egregious reports of really awful humanitarian rights violations. It is clear there's been widespread murder, widespread rape, and widespread looting, pillaging and destruction of property. We, Her Majesty's government, are clear there needs to be an end to this impunity in the region. You know, it gets worse, Chair. You know, humanitarian workers right from the outset were targeted. Sadly, 5 Ethiopians working for international organisations that received UK funding were killed early on in the conflict, putting their lives trying to help others. It is complex. I'm sure we'll want to probe on Eritrea's role in the conflict. Is deeply troubling. The presence of the Eritrean military personnel in Tigray is destabilising for Tigray, Ethiopia and the region. The UK government called for an immediate withdrawal of the Eritreans from Tigray. That is a point that I made personally to the Tigrayan ambassador earlier this week. So we're closely engaged. The Foreign Secretary visited in January with his team. He also visited when he was there the humanitarian hub, and also addressed the political situation through a meeting or several meetings with Prime Minister Abiy, where particularly he was raising the importance of access for humanitarian access, because without that access, we can't do the business of helping people, but we don't know what's actually happened. Otherwise, we're just operating on second-hand reports. So access is absolutely key. which is why we've been calling for access since November. Recently, the government of Ethiopia has introduced a new system which means that you can notify, humanitarian organisations can notify, then go rather than waiting to receive permission. We'll work with humanitarians to see how this enables them to get out and reach more of Tigray, but most of Tigray is inaccessible. And let me conclude by saying that without a marked improvement in access and a drastic scaling up of assistance, we will see a significant deterioration in the humanitarian situation across Tigray. And that is likely, at all probabilities, to make the situation in Ethiopia more complex and less stable, and worryingly across the near neighbours and slightly beyond the near neighbours. We've got to get this one right.
So the committee shares your concerns, which is why we're having this inquiry, because we want to highlight what is going on there and try and put more pressure, because the knock-on consequences, if we don't act swiftly, are pretty horrendous and unimaginable, both for Ethiopia itself, but also, as you say, the surrounding areas. I'd like to bring in Pauline Nathan, please.
Thank you very much. Good to see you, Minister, and good to see Alastair again, who I think I met in Sudan, was it? I can't remember now. I've met you a couple of times, and of course I met Christian as well, so it's good to see the team. Minister, we know that there's difficulties in FCDO at the moment because of the amount of money that is being cut drastically. So can you tell us what money has the UK government pledged for this humanitarian crisis caused by the conflict in Tigray in this current financial year and next, and what budget line does that money come from?
Thank you for that question. As the other lady knows, it's quite a complex question, given some of the numbers she's asking for have not been decided on. Some that have started to be decided on but haven't been announced, and the figures historically are complex. In terms of the perspective, 300 million in the last reporting period, that's 2019 to 2020. But I'll ask Christian to come in on this bit more detail. But I think if I'm right, the Honourable Lady has been following the Ambassador through Palestine, Sudan, and now through this meeting. So multiple interactions.
Yes, I have seen him several times over several years.
Indeed. Christian, can you give a bit more nuance of the numbers, particularly the targeted numbers around humanitarian rather than the economic development work?
Yes, and actually, could you also, whilst you're doing that, tell us how much of that money that's been promised has actually been dispersed?
Sure, I'm very happy to build on the Minister's remarks. The amount that has specifically been allocated to Tigray, to the humanitarian response, there's £15.4 million over the last 3 months. As the Minister was saying, there are further discussions underway, but that amount has been announced and has also been dispersed already. And just to give you an idea of what we are supporting here, essentially we are trying to support the humanitarian coordination in general. As was being mentioned, there's a huge question over the data, how many people are in need, the large number of humanitarian agencies who are trying to establish or re-establish their presence. So we're supporting both the UN, but also the OCHA, the humanitarian agency of the UN, to support the coordination. We recognize the need that food supplies are critical. So we're working with the World Food Programme, WFP, on food. But we also very much recognize some of the other challenges that were being mentioned, particularly by our colleague from World Vision. And some of the funding goes through UNICEF to look particularly at child protection issues and at some of the wider civilian protection agendas that I think came out very clearly in the first part of this panel.
Thank you. And do you know, you've talked about in the last 3 months, was anything used for humanitarian crisis before January?
Yeah, the humanitarian budget, both through the UN systems, but then also through the safety net program and other channels that we're using, for example, that are targeted at refugees. That was well over £100 million in the current financial year. We don't know the exact numbers yet because the year is not yet closed. So this amount that I mentioned is only for Tigray and only since the crisis started.
Yeah, can you tell me how much of that funding that you spent has gone to local agencies, how much to international NGOs, and how much to the multilateral agencies, like when you mentioned UN, WFP?
Yeah, so it is a combination of those. The government-run system that a large number of development partners are contributing to, the productive safety net system, which reaches 8 million people in Ethiopia, is a vehicle that we have been building up, both for regular support, but also for emergency support. That is complemented by money we're putting directly to, for example, the World Food Programme that is used by the World Food Programme, but also money that we're putting into the UN Ethiopia Humanitarian Fund, which the UN then allocates to organizations like World Vision. So I would need to look exactly at how that money is distributed, but we're using all of the channels that you mentioned.
Would it be possible for you to let us know after this?
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Can I bring in Brendan Clark-Smith, please?
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everybody. Minister, in terms of the humanitarian interventions, what is the UK funding at the moment? Could you give us some more details about that, please? I think you're on mute, Minister.
Thank you. I mean, to be fair, I'm struggling to go beyond what Christian has outlined. As we move forward, clearly more can be done in Tigray if greater access is provided. Was there anything in particular you were looking at? I mean, to be frank, the other elements of the programme that Christian hasn't gone into are the more things supporting economic development and open societies. I'm conscious when I said it's a complicated situation. We've got elections coming up in June in Ethiopia, and a lot of the spend is in other areas. In fact, when I was there in July, the key flashpoint was in the Oromo province, not the Tigrayan province. So the budget is quite widely spread beyond Tigray.
Okay, so in terms of just following on from that, what about coordinating the UK's response with other donors, for example? So what are we doing to make sure there isn't any duplication of the effort there?
Well, and certainly I engage with the international. So the gentleman from the World Food Programme, his boss David Beasley, I've spoken to on a regular basis throughout this crisis. I've also spoken at a special meeting of the United Nations on regional coordination. I've also done work with the African Union, both directly through the old the commissioners and the new commissioners that have just been appointed, through the chair, Faki, but also through the president, less so directly through Cyril Ramaphosa, the outgoing president. My interlocutor was more people in the Ministry of Finance, but more directly with President Tshisekedi of the DRC, who is now the president of the AU. But a lot of this work is done on the ground, either at a very detailed level with the Humanitarian and Development Director, Christian, or the broader brush coordination at a political level between the ambassadors. So when I was last there, met a number of international players. The US have just appointed a new ambassador to Ethiopia. I believe Alastair met her within the last week or two. So it's very much our bread and butter, getting it out there and passing the baton from these visits that Christian's been on, and going back and telling the other internationals where we have been, things to follow up. And in the early days of the crisis, I was getting as many reports from international counterparts via the embassy as directly from the embassy. So there is a strong degree of coordination. Alastair, is there any other ways where we should be coordinating where we're not, or any other good examples of where we've coordinated to great effect?
No, I think that details very well, Chris. Thank you for that. It's nice to hear that you've been having such dialogue on it. So and that clearly that duplication is not happening. So thank you very much for that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Could I just sort of push you a little bit on it? We heard from the earlier witnesses that both the health system and the education system has pretty much collapsed. They're obviously two of your government's key priorities, 2 of the 7. Looking forwards, will you be looking to sort of plug those gaps to meet your priorities?
I can ask Christian to come in, but also to give some context, because one of the problems is that there's just not access. So even understanding the nature of the problem and also trying to gain consistent access, so not being blocked by Eritrean soldiers and the complexity that's around the provisional government and perhaps outlining what the provisional regional authorities, sorry, I'm using this in my terminology, are doing. And some of the territory, which we would describe as Tigray, is also under the control of the Amharans, or is inaccessible. So before this detailed planning and coordination, as a fundamental, is getting that access and understanding. So to a degree, it's a little bit premature around talking about the detailed solutions before we've even seen the nature of the problem and got it in there. And Christian, could you come in and perhaps, with your permission, Chair, explain a bit more about what you saw when you were boots on the ground? I mean, I would have loved to have got up there myself to understand it, but we're unable to. But through your eyes, perhaps.
Yes, happy to do so, and also to provide a bit more information on the specific questions about health and education. So both of those areas are feature very prominently in the portfolio of the Ethiopia Development Program here. But the issues as far as Tigray is concerned are very different. So aside from the work that we've already discussed on the humanitarian side, we are working very closely with the Ministry of Education and with the Ministry of Health, because the long-term solution that has to be discussed as well as the re-establishment of those basic services, in addition to any urgent food and so on requirements. But as I said, the situation is very different. From the perspective of the health sector, already the previous witnesses said that a lot of the facilities are not functional at the moment, the majority of them. And a key challenge there is that they have been looted. And the other challenge that was also mentioned is that many of the health workers aren't there anymore. And so you have this combination of missing equipment or damaged facilities and lack of personnel. So literally today we are having conversations about how do you operate in a space like that? Because if you just were to ship medicines, it's not clear that they would reach the beneficiaries. So there are lots of discussions now about actually mobile clinics that have the medicines that distribute them, but they don't leave them in locations. And likewise also the deployment of health workers and the provision of other things that have disappeared. For education, it is very different. As the previous witness on from World Vision said, the education sector in Tigray was closed because of COVID and hasn't restarted since then. And because of the large displacement of civilians who have fled the conflict, many of them are actually in the schools. So to follow up the invitation from the minister, when we were in Mekelle, the capital of Tigray, we actually visited one of those schools and we met with a lot of the people who were displaced in that location. It was a normal school that now has 3,000 displaced people registered there, who were basically, on the one hand, receiving relatively good shelter just because it was a permanent structure. But on the other hand, of course, it is impossible to restart education when the schools are occupied, if you want to use that word, by people who have been displaced. And the stories that we heard were very much the ones that you've heard from the previous witnesses, which is large-scale conflict, serious human rights violations, extrajudicial killings, rape, and the other atrocities that by now have been reported quite widely. I'm happy to say a bit more about that, but maybe back to the Minister or the committee first.
Thank you. So what I'm hearing from you is that they remain priorities, but it's so unstable in some areas that you're not able to deliver them at the moment. Would that be the correct assumption?
So on education, the conversation is how do we restart in a place like Tigray at the moment, whereas in health, the question is how do we work with the facilities that are there and complement without essentially the money being lost due to looting or further damages.
Thank you very much. Can I bring in Brenda Sharma, please?
Thank you, Chair. Minister, are you seeing the level of humanitarian access you would like in a relation to Tigray?
I'm not seeing the level of access that we would like and we would need. Until we get the full access, we won't know the full extent of the problems. And just to go back a little and the Chair's assertion or summation around education and health being a priority, I would say it will be, but the access has got to be key, and there's nothing predefined. You know, we are not the conflict hasn't ended, and we're not going in there to sort things out and build back immediately. There is a significant chance that things could go backwards. The TPLF haven't put down their arms. So kind of stabilising the region and getting access, getting understanding of what the needs are, and then providing, in a sensible order of priority against needs. But sadly, some of the needs will be very, very, very basic. And even more basic than the right to education and a health service, but just getting clean water and food to people and stopping the rape and the forced removal of people from areas will be critical. And I'm unclear when we're going to get to that point at the moment, but critical to that is the Eritreans leaving and getting that access and stability.
Thank you. Do you see any conflict when you talk to the aid agencies at the ground level and they say, Minister, we have these needs and how to access to those needs? And when you talk to the minister or the government level, they give you the totally opposite to what the grassroots or the ground level people are saying. Do you see there's any conflict in that?
Well, I mean, I deal with the kind of the ministerial and ambassadorial level, and in a lot of these dialogues, there's a desire to put the context. The Ethiopians talk a lot about re-establishing law and order, talking about the long-standing issues with the TPLA and the history, and putting context around it, which is helpful, but sometimes is used to justify their activities, and clearly some of the activities of all of the players are wholly unjustified. It is inconceivable that any player in this environment has not committed atrocities or committed actions that we would be quite shameful of and wholly critical. In relation to the stories from on the ground, I'll defer to Christian who talks to these people, but would also add, as well as the aid organisations, there's increasing access from news agencies, both local and international. I think I've seen some pieces from the BBC and Sky in particular that show the devastation, the killing, the burnt out buildings, the burnt out military vehicles, the shallow graves, and the volumes of bullets piled up that have come out of the machine gun. You shudder to think of what happened there months ago. But Christian, anything on the local feedback from NGOs that are going into places that were accessible even to you?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say, as was mentioned, that there are diverging perspectives on the situation that we hear about from people who are in Addis versus people who are actually traveling in the region. But to give you an illustration of that, the fact is, as the minister said and as the previous witnesses said, that there has been progress on access in terms of moving from a system where it's required to have a permit to a notification system, which was hugely welcomed and which made a big difference. But if you now see what's happening is that basically most of the airports in Tigray are closed. So people coming in are flying into Mekelle, and then from there it is road movements. And as you also heard previously, it is very likely that you will encounter roadblocks that are sometimes manned by the Ethiopian military, sometimes by the TPLF, and sometimes by Eritreans, and in other places by Amharan special forces. So you have the situation whereby you have multiple actors, and even though you have a notification system and you can fly to Mekelle and get into a car, you will find very quickly that the situation becomes unpredictable, including the security situation across the region, as people were saying, being very fluid, and that changing also from week to week or month to month. So I think that is part of the reason why you hear very different descriptions of the situation.
Thank you. Minister, what are you doing to improve humanitarian access to Tigray? And what kind of challenges do you face in doing so?
Personally, I think the key is repeating the message at international level and having an honest dialogue, as I did the Eritrean ambassador, and I have done with various people from the Deputy Prime Minister, and I shouldn't say downwards, and across the Ethiopian government, and doing that in coordination with people like the World Food Programme to explain what we need to help, but also having this very careful, balanced relationship between being clear and public about what is actually going on, but also having a private dialogue to try to encourage all participants in our open dialogue, not just with the obvious participants, but other regional and international players that are involved or interested to try to get to the root problems. My fear is that the situation in Tigray will develop alongside other neighbouring problems. So this will become more and more difficult to deal with. And so that is my focus, to stabilise this situation so we can see East Africa is a focus of the British government across Africa. We want to put more focus on that area, that long-term relationship, and the situation in Tigray is mitigating against that, not for that, and is sucking up not just international money, but focus. And that's probably the bigger worry, that other things will go wrong around the region because the international community is so focused diplomatically in terms of brain power, rather than totally separate to the arguments around money. The solution for humanitarian is money, but the problem is fundamentally one of politics and diplomacy.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister, you gave me sort of nice question that I wanted to ask both you and Alastair. I agree with you. I think that Ethiopia is sort of a keystone in the region, and which is why this committee is so concerned about its long-term stability. I wonder if you could both speak about how you prevent what's happening in Tigray spilling out into both the rest of the country, but also what's happening in Ethiopia not impacting on the rest of the region. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the sort of the political and diplomatic steps that you're taking to both prevent that, but also enable the humanitarian aid and then the development work to start to stabilise the region after that.
Well, if I may, if I can do a superficial tour of the problems and some of the mitigations, and Alastair can add in more detail. So we've spoken of Eritrea. I won't deal with that again. There was a flood of people across the Sudanese border and then back. The Sudanese made their border, the 1902-1903 border, much harder than it had been, pushing back Amharan farmers that were effectively preparing lands and had been tending lands on the Sudanese border. So that there's a potential flashpoint there. And of course, Sudan is still relatively new and progressing democratic nation with Hamdok and the balance between Hamdok and the Sovereign Council. So, there's a whole separate diplomatic effort around that. I mentioned the Oromo people. I think we can go into more detail around the situation with Amhara. More broadly, the ambassadors warned me that, Tigray is only 6% of the population. The elections probably won't happen there anyway, but the majority of the election and the electoral risks and opportunities are out in the rest of the country. So deploying resource more widely there. And then on broader diplomacy around issues like the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which is very controversial in the Horn, given the flows of water around Egypt and Sudan. So those are some of the dynamics that we're engaging with. And I've not even started on the issues coming across from the Middle East and the Red Sea, where we've appointed an envoy sitting not above but across some of these issues, because it is really complex. And in a classic diplomacy, you can pick up a pin and stick it in any place and look around that, and the world looks very different to if you stuck a pin the other end of the country. So that's kind of a beginner's guide to what we're doing. For the full version, can I turn to you, Alastair, to correct my inaccuracies subtly?
Thanks very much, Minister. Could I just check that you can hear me okay? Oh, great. Well, we are extremely active, of course, within the country, but also in the region. We coordinate with other embassies here in Addis. We coordinate with all sorts of players in the region, including our embassies and high commissions in neighbouring countries, so that we can see both sides of the telescope, whichever way you're looking at it. So here in Addis, for instance, yes, we've been working on Tigray. It is huge. It's a big challenge to the country. It is also a big challenge to the way the government has tried to operate as we come up to 3 years since Abiy took power. In that time, I think one of the most interesting phenomena I have observed is the changing relationship between the central government and the regions. Whereas before there was authoritarian government from the centre, that has changed dramatically. Tigray is the most extreme version of that, but it's not the only one. The Minister has mentioned conflict in Oromia, and in Amhara, but there have also been conflicts in places like Benishangul-Gumuz and Gambela, which continue. So we're trying to keep it across all of that. We travel as widely as we can. It's not been easy because of COVID. That has restricted not only our presence in the embassy, because we did have to draw down last year, but also our ability to travel around the country. It's picking up a bit at the moment. And so we are trying to make sure that ahead of what we see as almost a perfect storm from June, where we've got the elections happening at the beginning of June, as the Minister said, probably not in Tigray, but certainly in the rest of the country, but also in coordination with our colleagues in the neighbouring countries, in our embassies, making sure that any possible cross-border difficulties are being mapped by us, and that we are not only messaging to each of those governments, but doing it in coordination with partners who change from country to country. What the Tigray crisis has also done for our international engagement here is make sure that we coordinate with anyone who might have influence, and that doesn't necessarily mean our traditional partners, such as the US and the EU, but others from closer to the region who have key interests at stake. So we're trying to make sure that the coordination is good. We're trying to make sure that the analysis is as full as it possibly can be. And again, that means drawing on sources we haven't always been able to in the past. And it also means that we have different types of conversations with countries who previously were reluctant to do so. I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm happy to take more.
It does. I wonder if you could speak a little more, Ambassador, around the elections and why that is a point of concern for you from a sort of a country stability, but also from a development and humanitarian position.
Well, the elections were always going to be a problem. Even before COVID, we were concerned about how they could be held with the huge logistical challenges and the fact that at the beginning, when the elections were originally announced or due to take place, the capacity of the National Election Board of Ethiopia was minute. It was tiny. The UNDP are the international agency doing most to support the elections, and when the then Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt was here in 2019, he announced some significant financial support to UNDP, but that was mainly around the security of the elections, and that remains a concern. While we have so much insecurity, while we have the logistical difficulties, while you have opposition parties boycotting the elections, as they've just announced, then it's very difficult to run a credible and safe election, and particularly in June when we're getting towards the rainy season. So the logistical challenges there would have been anyway could well be complicated if the rainy season arrives early. So there's insecurity, massive insecurity across a lot of the country. It's not only in Tigray. We have seen, for instance, 2 years ago, the regional president of Amhara was murdered in June 2019. Also, the same day, the chief of defense staff was murdered here in Addis Ababa. In June this year, last year, it's only March, isn't it? In June last year, there was a murder of a young activist in Oromia, and that led to great insecurity as well, which is still being played out. And that Oromia is a concern because it's a third of the population of Ethiopia. So you're talking about 36 or 37 million people just in that region. Amhara is still in difficulty, and that's before we go to the other regions. So we are concerned about the ability of the election board to run a safe election, both in terms of being able to get the ballot boxes, to train enough people to be able to run, for people to be able to vote safely on the day, and then afterwards for the people who don't win, if they have taken part, to accept the result of it. So there are all sorts of risks attached to the election. I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you very much. Can I bring in Chris Law?
Thank you, Chair. It's a question for the Minister. We've already seen a diminishing UK aid budget diverted away from countries such as Yemen and South Sudan, which are racked by war, extreme poverty, and on the verge of famine. Given what you've been hearing today with regard to the challenges in Ethiopia and what's happening to neighbouring countries, I wanted to know what your thoughts were in terms of what impact with the announced cuts to UK ODA will have on aid provision by UN agencies, NGOs, and the SCDO in Ethiopia.
And clearly, having made a decision because of the UK financial position, to move to 0.7 to 0.5, that has consequences to the existing programme, the ability of what we can do going forward, but also crucially the flexibility that we don't have, that we did have with a rising GNI and quite rapidly rising budget over the last 6 years. In terms of that, I think there's a big difference in terms of the impact of that directly on multilaterals and our bilateral programme. So on the multilateral programme, statement the obvious, our full contribution, as was last time, is a small percentage part of the whole. So directly in financial a massively significant impact on the overall multilateral spend globally within the region. And the multilateral spend will be a lot of our commitment, whereas some of the things that are more flexible would be our bilateral spend and our flexibility. So one of the key challenges on a reduced budget is making sure the bilateral spend is right, and that's where I'll be spending more time to make sure that we get the most benefit. But also, the development expertise of the UK is preeminent in the international community, and the merger of the department tried to bring that together with diplomacy to make it even better, not to diminish it. But I know others will have different views, but to make sure that leverage role is still there. And where it will be a challenge is with looking at the budget, you naturally look towards the very Humanitarian situations and making sure that we leave enough of some of the other smaller programs to work with the long-term development of civil society, the long-term stability of elections, the media, and so forth, as well as the big-ticket programs. So these are the types of programs that, as you go beyond aid, you put more money into. So less humanitarian, less volume, less money, but more programs, more technical, more specialist, more leveraging the development heritage of the UK. But the other thing at play is we have said that we will focus particularly in East Africa, and that particularly means Kenya and Ethiopia. So notwithstanding the Tigrayan conflict, I think we would be wanting to pay particular attention to making sure we still have the ability to control those levers in Ethiopia, notwithstanding a reduced overall budget. It's quite a complicated answer, but it is quite complicated.
It might be complicated, but cuts have consequences. People die. So bluntly, what I want to ask is, will you be defending the budget for next year to maintain at least the same as it has been this year, particularly in the light of what's happening in the Tigray region? Or are we to see cuts? And let's be honest about this. This will mean the loss of many thousands of lives.
Well, I mean, we made the decision to go from 0.7 to 0.5, and that clearly does have consequences. And my job as a minister is to maximise the upside of the spend and minimise any downside. I can't at this stage make any commitments to thematic programs or countries specifically, but what I can say to you, and it's in the the integrated review launched by the Prime Minister on Tuesday and referenced heavily in the speech of the Foreign Secretary on Wednesday, that there is a long-term commitment to Ethiopia. You can't name check every country in the world, but those commitments were made in early drafts predating even the situation in Tigray. So I suppose I'll end my answer where I started my statement. Ethiopia is incredibly important to us and is our biggest bilateral program, and is going to remain very, very big in our programming.
Nevertheless, sympathy doesn't save lives. Moving on, to get a bit more detail, how have UK programs in Ethiopia changed in response to the crisis in Tigray?
I'll ask Christian to come in on this, because there's some things that we would be doing that we physically can't, and then the programs need to morph some flexibility. And he talked about the 15 million as well. Do you want to add anything to that Christian?
Sure, I'm happy to add to that. So the specific examples of how the programs have changed is that we have put additional resources into the areas that we discussed at the beginning of the call. First is previously there was no humanitarian crisis in Tigray as such. There were quite a few people who were dependent on food aid and on safety net, but that was very much managed. So the additional funding that I mentioned at the beginning, the 15.4 million, for example, included working with UN agencies and working with organizations like the International Committee of the Red Cross, specifically working on those new challenges in Tigray that we didn't have to work on before. But at the same time, we've also seen that as a result of the fact that, as was mentioned, the administrative structures in Tigray had broken down, it was not possible to channel some of the money that had previously been allocated to those mechanisms. And so we've been making adjustments in light of the fact that we still wanted to reach beneficiaries there, but we were no longer able to use the same often government coordinated mechanisms that existed beforehand.
Thank you, Christian. And maybe just to follow on from that, what ways has this crisis made you think differently about approach to conflict prevention and peace building programs? And maybe, Christian, you can tell me what effect you think cuts to UK ODA is going to have on being able to adapt and change your approach.
I come in on the general point now, I'll come to Christian around the ODA. I mean, a year ago when I kind of joined this role, you start thinking about territories and the regions, but I think the people matter enormously. Abiy won the Nobel Peace Prize for stopping the war with Eritrea and Ethiopia, but actually investing in relationships and in people, because of all these situations we talked about, and we hadn't even mentioned Somalia and the Ethiopian influences there. The one constant is the political leadership and getting a closer understanding of the people involved, their motivations and their histories. And almost every time I go back to an area, I look back on my old self from my previous visits and say how naive I was, and add another layer of complexity, which is why having people on the ground for longer periods of time, having that corporate history, having ambassadors and development directors that go somewhere early in their career and then come back, but also do posts, as Alastair did in South Sudan, that are nearby. So there's that context and longevity of relationships. And we've got people like Stefan Durkin, who's advising the Foreign Secretary, particularly on some of these issues, who spent hours with President Abiy, having that understanding. Christian, can I ask for your reflections both on the crisis and I think the changes in overspend?
Sure, and also maybe to come back to the specific question on how we think about the conflict and handling that. So I think I've said as much as I could in terms of how we have adjusted the approach to humanitarian spending, but then also the vehicles we're using in light of the Tigray crisis. But I think it's fair to say that we have been, since the crisis in Tigray started over the last 3 months, very quick in terms of supporting the different agencies that either play a critical role in terms of coordination, like UN OCHA, or that are ready to provide emergency support, like the World Food Programme. I can't comment, as the Minister was saying, on the future, but I wanted to come back also to the point on conflict, because I think this is something where the approach to Ethiopia has changed, unfortunately, in the sense that for many years, the key challenges in Ethiopia were climate disasters, natural disasters around drought, more recently locusts. But what we have seen over the last 2-3 years is increased humanitarian need, but also development need as a result of conflict. So the figure of 2.7 million people displaced in Ethiopia before the Tigray war is already quite staggering, but even more staggering is the fact that 68% of them were displaced by conflict. So what we have done over the last 2 years already is first and foremost building up the capacity of the embassy here to engage on those issues. When I arrived in Ethiopia, we did not have conflict specialists in the embassy. We have brought in that expertise, and in fact, we're just recruiting to maintain and build on that expertise to allow us to engage on conflict analysis. But then likewise also, we are building up the capacity in some of our partners who traditionally have more on drought issues, for example, really to engage with conflict dynamics in a way that they weren't prepared for.
Thank you. Can I bring in Pauline Latham?
Yes, I just wanted to make a comment, Minister. You said twice in your evidence then that we have made the decision to cut the aid budget from 0.7 to 0.5. My comment would be, but Parliament hasn't yet. Thank you.
Yeah, the distinction is a fair one. The Development Act allows for 0.7 to not be met, but we are looking to try to get back as soon as we can fiscally to the 0.7. But just listening to the debate on Tuesday, I appreciate lots of members feel very passionately about that, and there's a very active debate around these issues and the timescales and interpretation of that act. But I'm not going to get all legal on the situation. I think that's a debate we have at a different time.
I think there is a difference in the interpretation of the Act, and the department's got one interpretation and some others of us have a different one. Thank you.
And I think that will probably be played out in the courts, the way things are going. Can I bring in Brenda Sharma, please?
Thank you, Chair. Minister, how is the FCDO planning to support a transition to peace and stability in Tigray?
It feels like a long way off, that the peace and stability, just basically stabilizing. I mean, we can't even get into the country. I think it's just going to be a multi-layered approach, both at ministerial level, at international level. I would hope that the region plays an even greater role. I know informally there have been a number of discussions going on. The African Union sent 3 wise people, 3 ex-leaders of, I think it was Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Botswana from memory, to speak to Abiy, to engage, because no amount of effort dealing with the humanitarian travesty as a result of this is actually going to stabilize the region. The problem is a fundamentally kind of political conflict and quite long-standing. The Tigrayans, representing 6% of the population, effectively were running the country for a number of years, and things seem to be turned on their heads now, and played out in a very different way. I'm conscious, Chair, that I've not drawn heavily on our ambassador. Can I ask him to come in, and also if there's anything that he feels that I've mentioned to come in on a slightly wider piece?
Would you like me to, Minister, would you like me to address that particular question or something else?
Feel free to address that question, but also if you feel that the International Development Committee, don't have all the information or particular angles, answer the questions that haven't been asked that are important as ambassador, that you think we should be asking as parliamentarians, and I should be asking as the executive.
Yes, speaks a former committee member. Thank you, Minister.
I think what I would say in answer to the question is that we are, of course, doing a great deal of planning to see how we can support any future peace in Tigray. We have made it clear from the very first day that there is no military solution to the difficulties between the central government and the TPLF. We've made it absolutely clear, and not everyone has done that. What we've also been at pains to do is to make sure that we are coordinating in the closest possible way with those who have influence, and also, to be honest, to identify who does have influence. We have made it clear that we will play any supportive role to whoever drives this forward, and it's quite clear that this, as with so many other difficulties on the continent, it will have to be led by Africans, not in the first place. And the African Union has and continues to have a conversation with Abiy and others. The neighbouring countries are doing what they can, and we are keeping in close contact with them. The regional organisation IGAD is slightly quiet at the moment, but we are trying to press them to get involved if and when the AU decides to go its usual route in terms of regional conflicts, which is to, they have this principle of subsidiarity where responsibility devolves to the regional organisation. So we're trying to support both of them in identifying what will need to be done. We stand ready to provide any sort of advisory or experiential or even technical knowledge we have. I myself have worked on 4 peace processes as part of the mediation, not as an observer. And we have pretty good contacts with the people who would help. We do lots of scenario planning, as you would expect, just to map out how things might go. So we're not short of ideas or indeed of energy, and we're coordinating with those who also bring the same sorts of experience, whatever, but primarily this will be solved and resolved on the continent. In terms of, I think what the Minister may have been alluding to in tensions, one thing we haven't really touched on, but is a real difficulty, is the border tension with Sudan. Sudan is going through a transition, and they would like to be able to focus on it, no doubt. And this border tension is, in our view, quite dangerous if it is not reined in. And so we coordinate very closely with our colleagues in Khartoum to make sure that we are trying to do our utmost with others to press both sides to de-escalate that particular situation as well. I'm quite happy to take any further questions you might have.
That leads nicely, Alastair, to my next follow-up is that peace building and stabilization process, which is, you said, started already. And one section of the community is always ignored. That is the women and the girls. How do you see your role or FCDO's role to make sure that they are not left out or not ignored, their contributions and the part of that process of peacekeeping and stabilization?
No, it's a very good question, and it's one we press everyone on, including the African Union. We haven't actually talked about the African Union much at all. And the African Union has a group known as FEMWISE, which are female peace negotiators, that they have a team in the AU with whom we are coordinating very closely. And we would like to see that particular process grow and for female negotiators to deploy to peace negotiations, not only so that they bring a different angle to the negotiating team, but also are able to draw in better the female representatives, the female and the women in the communities and girls too, who might feel more comfortable speaking to female negotiators rather than to the usual male negotiators they face.
Thank you.
Minister, we keep on hearing about the horrific levels of sexual violence and rape that's going on in the country. Do you see it deliberately being used as a weapon of war?
That is what people are saying is happening, and I have no reason to believe that is wrong. Both the verbal accounts of what's happened, but to get the solid evidence is tricky. I mean, I know that sexual violence was reported to Christian and his team. Where you draw the line on that being just something that's horrific, or where it's targeted at a population and where it becomes a weapon of war. I suppose it's a horrific act, which however one categorises it, but it's clear that the evidence needs to be collected. There should be no impunity, because if people feel that they can get away with these types of behaviours, those behaviours will be repeated either within the region, the area, or internationally. I don't know whether, Christian, there's any particular evidence that NGOs on the ground have uncovered that you've seen, or indeed, Alastair, that you could add to that.
As the minister said, we definitely heard those stories when we spoke with displaced people in a way that echoed what we had previously heard from humanitarian agencies or from journalists who had also been to the region. And I think it's difficult to judge when it is a weapon of war. I think one gets into legal terminology there as well. But I think one of the encouraging things to point out is that because Ethiopia has quite a few women in important leadership positions, half the cabinet being women and the president being being a woman, those stories really have been picked up, and both the president and some female cabinet members have spoken out about the fact that this is completely unacceptable for rape to happen at that scale on Ethiopian soil. And so I think one of the things we are actually doing, in addition to some of the specifics that we touched on already, which is working with the UN on protection of children and displaced people, is actually trying to see how we can operate in that space that has opened up, with actually senior Ethiopian politicians having spoken out as well, and having in a way created that opportunity to engage at the more senior political level as well.
And on that, do you think that that leadership will lead to a reduction in FGM, in child marriage, and a focus on trying to prevent the trafficking of particularly women into the international sex trade?
I think it's fair to say that the opportunities are there to discuss those issues openly in Ethiopia, which is not the same as in many of the other countries that I've worked in, but also that we have good technical cooperation with the Ministry of Labour, but also with the Ministry of Women and Children Affairs on issues, for example, about women migrants going to the Gulf, and supporting that to be legal, that to be happening on transparent, in transparent ways, and to complement that with activity to tackle the smuggling that's happening alongside. So I think it's an area where there's quite a lot of work to do, but also where we feel both at the political and the technical level we have the ability to work and to make a difference.
Thank you. That's very heartening to hear. Can I bring in Brent Clark-Smith, please?
Thank you, Chair. Minister, you were talking earlier about the importance of Ethiopia and our commitment to it. How is work to achieve peace and stability in Ethiopia and the wider region going to contribute to work on other development challenges, would you say?
I mean, everything is quite closely linked. So getting that stability allows a resource, whether that's the African Union or diplomatic resource of the country, to project outside. And listening to Christian talk about the president and the female balance in cabinet, it wasn't a long time ago, less than 6 months, we were talking about Ethiopia really motoring in the right direction. You talk of gender balance, you talk of liberalising the telecommunications sector, which I know sounds a technical thing, but with that comes opportunity to communicate and trade in different ways. There's potentially a building block to liberalise the financial marketplace, which allows for transformational change, leadership in the region, and saying that there is a different way of doing business in an open and democratic way, and getting on that trajectory. And I would like to think that we could get back, having started saying, it is grim, it doesn't have to be that way. And there are some very, very strong counter narratives that could come through. But at the moment, the slightly grimmer narratives are holding force. And in terms of peace and security in the region, the first thing Ethiopia can do is can take it out the problem category and put it back into the shining, glossy example of what you could do. The reforming Abiy, the Nobel Prize winner, liberalizing marketplaces, bringing elections to Ethiopia and bringing peace to the situation in Tigray. That was the narrative 6 months ago, and it seems wildly optimistic to get back to that within another 6 months, but that is the thing that will help the region.
Thank you. In terms of some of the long-term programs that have been going on to reduce poverty and hunger and the impact of climate change on vulnerable groups, I'm thinking things such as the Productive Safety Net program. Will we be continuing with those?
Aid has been a great success. So, I remember the 1980s and Live Aid, Band Aid. This is the region we're talking about, Tigray, and it's been a great success in the sense that when there is food insecurity, significant amounts of resource are generated through taxation in Ethiopia, tax programs which then fund the provision of basic services as well as the straight development spend. And the program you talk about, a cash transfer, have been very successful because instead of buying food and goods from elsewhere, food and goods are bought on the marketplace. So it not only provides for the individual, they buy what they need rather than what we think they need. There can differentials. And also because it's being bought locally, it can be quite transformational in having little microeconomies of people buying in bulk and then selling on and making a slight profit to feed their family. In a way, a normal market economy would work. So overall, I would say cash payments are probably something we'll see more of, but perhaps at a multilateral level more than a bilateral level. That's not to say we shouldn't do them at a bilateral level. And in fact, we've been at the cutting edge of demonstrating that these programs. We've also been at the cutting edge, not only of passing them on to multilaterals, but actually embedding them within the system of the country. So any social payments that the country are making can go through these models, and also we can flex them. When that distribution method's there, it's relatively easy, metaphorically, to press a button during a famine or a food crisis or a cyclone and put more money through that distribution system. So where, for financial reasons, we might be paring back the amount of money going through that system, I would very much want to be retaining it as a distribution mechanism for the multilateral, for the government. And sadly, in the case of need, because whilst Ethiopia does tend to be more resilient now, there are repeated problems of famine. I think it was Christian that mentioned the locusts, the cyclones, the climate change problems, and the problems of conflict. So yes, all these programs will change over time, but that's the point. No country wants to be permanently a recipient of aid, but it's not a question always of doing a program that was right and then closing it. It's transitioning it to the state and a productive economy. But all these problems mean that we're shifting money away to dealing with short-term issues and away from the bigger picture technical assistance and economic development assistance that will help grow the economy longer term. So it's a real paradox. And when Chris was talking about taking money out the system and that having a direct impact on not feeding someone, well, to a degree, that has always been a challenge within the development budget, not just because of the reduction in budget, but because of the balance between feeding someone today and feeding them over many days through contributing longer term.
Okay, thank you, Minister. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Minister, could I just give you a concrete example? Last week, I met a project that's funded by Christian Aid. It's the Coalition of South Sudan Churches. They have been receiving money through the Conflict and Security Fund to work with all the various different groups to try and maintain peace in that region. Their money ends at the end of the month. They've only just found this out. In terms of transition, they've had none. They've basically had 3 weeks' notice. That's one project, but in terms of the stability for the region, the consequences of that are pretty scary, because I do think of a house of cards that could start collapsing in that region. So could I ask you personally to have a look into that particular case and see if there is any transitional funding so that they don't fall off the cliff edge and the peace process doesn't go down with it.
I can certainly commit to looking at that specific program. I was in South Sudan recently, as Alastair said, he knows that area as well. But in terms of the current program, I will look at that. But a lot of programs were timed to fit with the financial year, so that it is a pinch point, and we're having to look at a lot of these things at the same time, and there's a lot of interaction between the different elements of funding. So there's the kind of multilateral, bilateral, there's programs that are run centrally, there's programs that are bought locally, but from the multilaterals. And then we heard of the situation where what appears to be a multilateral spend of UK government money that is ultimately spent on the ground by local NGOs. So looking at the changes in budget, working those all the way down and all the way back up is not a one-shot process, it's a reiterative process. And with the size of the budget, it won't be something that anybody is going to get 100% right. And would it through the committee encourage examples to be worked through? Some may need to change quite quickly. Others will be part of how we build back, because even at 0.5, even the most pessimistic of individuals expect quite a rapid growth in GNI. So the number, even before we start to look at the 0.7% issue, is going to come back. So we shouldn't necessarily just reinstate programs that were already there. We should look at this as a fresh opportunity to see how we do development, particularly with the fusion development and diplomacy and the overall mix. Also, we're very conscious that within a relatively short period of time, 4 years, we will be making spending decisions on money that's currently going through the EU. So yet again, another opportunity to use our development expertise and shift to a different development model, because that sounds like we've got a bad development model. But talking to one of the senior people who worked for us for a number of years, who was recently retiring, her message to me was, keep changing, keep challenging the development budget and keep doing things in different ways. I apologise if I've misinterpreted her comments, but I won't name it. But it bear with me as part of an exit interview. That kind of just keep innovating and keep.
Oh, Minister, we lost you for a moment. I think this committee's concern has consistently been about that overarching strategy, the complexity of all the different areas that DFID and now FCDO have funded or multilaterals that they've put support in. It is those unintended consequences, and I don't think we've seen the strategy about where that funding is going in the future, where gaps are going to either be plugged or the transition period is going to be supported through, which is why I raised that specific example. You will be very interested, hopefully delighted to know that this committee is actually doing an inquiry now into the philosophy and culture of aid, because like you, we want to make sure that that money has the best impact, empowers local people, has a long-term impact. And so we'll be feeding those thoughts and recommendations through to you. But can I just turn to Chris Law for the very last question, please?
Yes, I've almost departed from it there. Just, you mentioned locusts, climate, war, persecution, cyclones in Ethiopia. I just want to ask a really blunt question. Budgets are already down given the drop in GNI and also the drop in remittances. So can I ask you, Minister, if you can, I know you can't commit, but can you pledge you will attempt to defend the existing budget given the fact of the dire situation that Ethiopia is in?
Surprisingly, I was expecting remittances to drop through the floor during this time. Actually, some of the evidence is to the contrary, and that's actually gone up in some areas. So that's really good news, because in many countries, remittances dwarf the overall budget. Most people would find it easier giving money away and spending money than increasing a budget is always more comfortable than. But when I'm talking to people who are passionate within the department and passionate about outcomes, I think that really it's much better for our development to make decisions and choices and transitioning to a lower budget and getting us on a stable footing to transition back to 0.7%. So. I will be a strong advocate. I can commit to that, 100%. Whilst I've always been a proud member of Parliament for my own patch, also in my DNA is a bit of Africa along with the malaria. But I can't help but be anything other than a defender of the continent. But also longer term, I worry that of the world's poor, Asia is growing fast, and more of the world's poor, and you can pick any statistic, are African. That's going to get up to 95% within something like a 20-25 year period. And yes, Africa's growing, but it's growing slower than the OECD average. So that is to say, in relative terms, the bottom billion are still getting poorer despite the progress that they are making, and that troubles me greatly. And no amount of tinkering, doubling our international aid budget, indeed doubling the aid budget of the whole global community won't solve that problem. It has to be much more than just the money, which is why the Force for Good, the Open Societies work, the economic development work is a massive, massive part of the solution, and getting economies that, make money, pay tax, politicians that stand on elections as we do and saying, this one will tax you more and spend more, and this one will tax you less and spend less, and having those normal dynamics, and those normal dynamics just don't exist in many parts of the continent. So yes, I can promise you passion, a strong defence of Africa. I suspect we would defend different things in different ways, but that is inevitable.
Thank you, Minister. I agree with all the points you've made, but the key point being in strategic review, the tilt is to the specific and not Africa. So Africa's going to come out the worst out of all of this review. But thank you for your answer.
Thank you very much, Minister. If I could also ask the on behalf of situation in your international colleagues, it is a dire situation, and I think unless there is a cohesive, coherent international response to this, I do fear for what might happen to both that country and the region. Thank you very, very much. You have been very gracious and gone well over time, but I know this is a topic that is one of passion for you, so thank you for making that investment. Thank you also, Alastair and Christian, and very much for the work that you're doing out in Ethiopia at the moment. Committee, thank you for your time. Order. I now call this session closed.
The proceeding has ended.